Hello and welcome back to the foundation course in managerial economics. We had started our discussion on how to understand the effects of different policies of the government in the demand supply framework, the very simple demand supply framework that we started with, and we are looking at the impact of different policies of the government, whether it is a price control or a tax. And we are trying to understand what happens in such kinds of policy interventions by the government into a free market equilibrium. So, a free market equilibrium basically gives us intersection between the demand and supply curve, and it gives us the equilibrium price in the market and the equilibrium quantity in the market, which leaves both the consumers and the producers satisfied, and no one is left in the market who is looking for a good at the existing price and he's not getting it. So and we discussed that the government sometimes intervenes in the market where the market fails due to the various kinds of reasons, and we were discussing about taxes. In the last class we discussed about we looked at what happens when a tax is imposed on a buyer or on a seller, and what we saw was it does not matter whether the tax is on the buyer or the seller, because in both the situations the buyer and the seller are going to distribute the tax between themselves, and the amount of tax burden that the buyer bears and the amount of tax burden that the seller bears, that does not change if the tax is imposed on the buyer or the seller. That is, it's irrespective of which party the tax is imposed on, it is distributed in the same way in both cases between the buyer and the seller. So next thing, and we left the discussion looking at the typical example that we took, and in our example we saw that the buyer in both the cases, whether the tax was on the seller or the buyer, in both the cases buyer was bearing major part of the tax. We discussed about an example where the tax was 1.5 rupees per unit of product sold, and we saw that the buyer was bearing 1 rupee out of that 1.5 rupees, and the seller was bearing a tax of 0.5 rupees or 50 paisa out of that entire tax of 1.5 per unit of good. And we saw that it did not change whether it was on the buyer or the seller. So the question that we left our last discussion with was, what determines, is it that always the buyer bears the major part of the tax, or what is going to determine how much part of the tax the buyer is going to bear and how much part of the tax the seller is going to bear? And today we are going to see that the answer lies in our understanding of elasticity that we did a few lectures back. So we are going to discuss about elasticity and what impact elasticity, or rather price elasticity of demand and supply has on the incidence of taxes. So we are going to talk about elasticity and impact of taxes. We are going to show that if supply is more elastic than demand, buyers bear most of the tax burden. So if supply is more elastic than demand, buyers bear more of the tax burden. And let me illustrate through an example. Let me show on the board why that is so. So we are talking about a case. Case 1 is supply is so supply is more elastic than demand. Supply is more elastic than demand. So we draw a supply curve which is more elastic, means the supply curve is flatter. So we draw a very flat supply curve and a steep demand curve. So supply is more elastic than demand, and this is the equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. So this is what happens before taxes. Now say a tax is imposed of amount T. So the first thing that we can do when we are trying to find out the impact of a tax through this kind of diagram, what you can do is you can imagine a tax of T and straight away draw the amount of the tax between the demand and the supply curves. So this is the amount of tax that has to be paid to the government, and we know that whether it is the tax is imposed on the supply or on the seller or the buyer, the tax is going to be distributed in the same way in both the cases. And so this tax has to be paid by the seller and the buyer, and so this is the amount, this is the price that the seller is going to pay on the supply curve. This is the price that the buyer is going to pay on the demand curve. And so now what I am doing here is slightly different from the way I was illustrating the tax in the previous lecture. So just follow me through. So this is the equilibrium price and a tax has been imposed. So we imagine a tax of this size between the demand and the supply curve. So this is T. So let me color it. So this green line is the tax of amount T. So this tax is to be split between the supplier or the seller and the buyer, and the buyer, now the buyer pays a higher price of PB and the seller gets a lower price of PS than the equilibrium price. So this is how the tax is distributed between the two. And if you are interested to know how the diagram can be completed, looking at the new demand curve, looking at the new supply curve, etc., it's very easy to do that. If the tax is on the seller, what happens? The supply curve basically shifts up. So if it is on the seller, then the supply curve is going to be a parallel shift like this. This is the S1. And if it is on the buyer, if the tax is on the buyer, then the demand curve shifts downwards, that is, there is less demand now, and you can imagine this to be the new demand curve. This can be the new demand curve. So either it is the new supply curve or it is the new demand curve. In both the cases, in both the situations, the new prices are going to be PB and PS. In both the situations, the new prices are going to be PB and PS. And so even without drawing the shift in the demand or the supply curve, we can actually say how much of what is going to be the new price in the both cases. So now we can see that this is how the tax is divided between the two. So this is the green line is the amount of tax that has to be split up between the two, and earlier both were the price that the PB was equal to PS was earlier before tax, PB was equal to PS was equal to PE. After tax, PS is the price that the seller receives, which is less than PE, and buyer pays a price which is higher than PE, and the tax is split between the two. So PB minus PE, PB minus PE is equal to, PB minus PE is the amount paid by the amount of tax paid by buyer plus PE minus PS, this is the amount of tax paid by the seller. This is actually not paid by the seller, but this is a reduction in price that the seller now receives. So it's like the incidence of tax has fallen on the seller also. So the total amount that is equal to now T. So that is equal to T, and so that is equal to PB minus PS, and that is equal to T. So T is now split up between the two. Now coming back to our original question, that how much of the tax should the buyer pay and how much of the tax should the seller pay? Now in this situation we can clearly see that when we have drawn a flat supply curve and a steep demand curve, we can see that the amount of tax paid by the buyer is much higher than the amount of tax or the incidence of tax that falls on the seller. So here we can clearly see that this is the amount of tax paid by buyer and this is the small amount, this is the amount of tax paid by seller. This is the tax paid by seller, or it's a more correct way of saying it is the incidence of tax that falls on the seller. Because the tax has been imposed, the seller ends up receiving a smaller price than what he was receiving earlier. So it is like he has split up the amount of tax with the buyer. So so whether it is the tax has been imposed on the seller or the buyer, in both the cases we see in this situation that the buyer ends up paying major part of the tax, and the seller, the incidence or the burden, tax burden, is less on the seller. So this is what we see in the case where supply is more elastic than demand. Now this is what we illustrated through diagram. But what is the intuition behind it? Why does it happen this way? So I'm sure many of you have already figured that out, or the logic would be working in your brain already, that supply is more flexible. So when supply is more elastic, that means what? When supply is more elastic, that means that supply is more flexible, and so it is easier for suppliers to leave the market than consumers. So it is easier for suppliers to leave the market than consumers. So whenever there is tax in the market on any good, whether it is on the seller or the buyer, that means the market is not very friendly to either of them, because the price has been increased forcibly by the government and there is a tax on the product. So in such a situation, the one of the buyer and the seller, the party which is more rigid or which is more inflexible, that party has to bear the major part of the burden of the tax. So in this case, demand is steeper, which means the people probably this is a kind of necessary good, or there are no substitutes, or people are there are no substitute of this product. So people cannot change their habits or consumption requirements so easily. So even if the price increases or the market is not very friendly, still the buyers stick to the market. So in that case, obviously, the party which a party which is more flexible, that is the party which can leave the market, which can decide not to produce, since it's not the cost has gone up for the seller. So the seller might just decide that I'm going to produce less, or I'm going to I'm not interested in paying so much of tax, so I'm going to produce less per unit of output, I'm going to pay less tax. So in that case, the supplier is more flexible, so he can manage to get away with a lower, by bearing a lower part of the tax, and the party, the buyer, who has a very inelastic demand curve and cannot change his consumption requirements so easily, that party has to bear the major part of the tax. Next, we are going to show that when demand is more elastic than supply, sellers bear most of the tax burden. So again, it's just a matter of showing it graphically what happens, or in the through diagram what happens when demand is more elastic than supply. But again, I'm sure that the logic has already worked in your minds, that what happens when demand is more elastic than supply. So let's just draw the diagram and see what happens. So now we are discussing case 2, where demand is more elastic than supply. So demand is more elastic than supply, that means we have a very flat demand curve and we have a steep supply curve. So demand is more elastic than supply. Again, you have a equilibrium price PE and equilibrium quantity of QE. Now again, a tax of amount T is imposed. A tax of amount T is imposed, and so this is almost the same amount of tax that we have been drawing. So this is, let this be the tax, that is tax T. So this amount of tax is imposed, and so immediately we draw the amount of tax between the demand and the supply curves, and we get the after tax prices. So now along the demand curve, the buyer is going to pay a price of PB which is higher than the equilibrium price, and along the supply curve, the seller is going to receive a price of PS which is less than the equilibrium price, and this is the incidence of tax that is happening on the incidence of tax that is the seller is bearing. So this is now the tax creates a wedge which is split up between the seller and the buyer, and these are the prices, that the price that the seller gets, and this is the price that the buyer pays, and the difference is basically the amount of the tax. Now here we can clearly see that the amount of tax that the buyer is paying, that is this amount, this very small amount, this is the amount of tax the buyer is actually paying. No matter if the say the tax is, the amount of tax has been imposed on the buyer, then what happens? The demand curve basically shifts down by this amount. So the demand curve has made a huge shift downwards, but the tax that the buyer actually ends up paying is this very small amount. This is the part of the tax paid by buyer, and the seller ends up foregoing this amount of price per unit of the output. So earlier he was receiving PE, now he is receiving PS, and this is the amount which he is which is the amount he gets less than what he was getting in during equilibrium. So this is the amount that is part of the tax shared by the seller. So this is the part of the tax shared by the seller, and in this case we clearly see that since demand is more elastic than supply, what is happening is the amount of tax burden that the seller is bearing is now much more than the amount of tax burden that the buyer has to bear. And again the reason is again the same. Now demand is more flexible, that is buyers have more choices and can shift away more easily. So basically demand is flat, or it is a very elastic demand curve, means that demand is more flexible, that is probably the buyers have choices in the market, and when they see it is not too attractive to buy this product in the market with all these taxes, they will quickly shift their demand to probably a substitute good, or probably they will stop consuming this good altogether or reduce their consumption of this good because it's not so much of necessity to them. So in such a situation, and we can see that the amount by which the curve shifts in each of the cases, if you look at the earlier diagram also, you will see that the amount by which it shifts depends on how flat or steep it is. So if the demand, this is the amount of tax, the demand curve has made a huge shift, that means the demand is flexible and it has made a huge shift. On the other hand, supply is steep, and say if the tax had been on the supplier, in that case what would have happened? In that case, supply would have shifted this to the left or to the upwards, and this would have been the new supply curve. This would have been the new supply curve, and we can clearly see that the shift in the supply curve is also very small, which shows that which is basically happening because the intuition is that supply is probably inflexible, at least in the short run, or in the given circumstances supply does not adjust so easily, so the supplier is willing to bear major part of the tax than the buyers. So let's discuss some examples. Let's look at some examples. What happens in case of a luxury tax? What happens in case of a luxury tax? Often during the budget we hear that the tax on luxury goods has been increased, say tax on branded high-end products, or taxes on room rents in hotels, or say taxes on luxury cars, high-end cars. The tax has gone up, and sometimes even it happens that if the tax is on the buyer, we feel kind of happy that okay, the rich are paying more taxes now, and they'll have to cough up more money for every unit of luxury product that they consume. But does it happen that way? What have we learned from the exercises that we did right now? What kind of supply or demand curve does a luxury product have? Now, looking at demand first. Luxury product is not a necessary product, and sometimes luxury products have a lot of substitutes in the market also. So if the tax goes up on the luxury product, that basically means that so luxury product is, so in case of a luxury product, first looking at demand, is it elastic or inelastic? So luxury product is not a necessary product. It's not that people really need to consume it immediately, even if the price has gone up. So people can move to other substitutes, and so basically demand is highly elastic. So demand is highly elastic. What about supply? What about supply? What about the elasticity of supply of luxury goods? Now, in most cases, you can imagine if the luxury good is, say, as I said, if it is a high-end 5-star hotel rooms, or it is high-end cars, really luxurious cars, supply is going to be inelastic, at least in the short run. Why? Supply is inelastic at least in the short run, because that most supplying these kinds of products incur a lot of costs. Like, say for example, if there is a 5-star hotel, for the maintenance of the rooms, the hotels, the taxes that they pay for having the I'm not talking about the per unit tax, but I'm saying that the all the costs that are incurred by the hotels, they are quite high and they cannot be reduced. They are not so flexible in the short run. Later we are going to talk about variable cost and fixed costs, and we are going to see that in these hotels the fixed costs are very high. So basically hotels or even high-end cars, the plants, the manufacturing units, everything has been set. So all of a sudden, because the prices are high, the supplier cannot reduce the supply, or cannot all of a sudden decide that I'm not going to produce any more cars, or I'm going to cut down on the production of cars, because he already has created a enormous capacity, or even if not enormous, he has created certain capacity with some plan about production in the near future, and all of a sudden he cannot just cut back on production. So basically supply is inelastic. So supply is inelastic at least in the short run. So in such a situation, this is going to happen. Demand is more elastic than supply, and part of the tax paid by the buyer is going to be very small, and most part of the tax incidence is going to be would have to be borne by the supplier. So is that a good policy or bad? Now since we already said that the elasticity, from our understanding of elasticity that we discussed in the earlier classes, now income elasticity of demand or price elasticity of demand of luxury goods is very high. It's a very elastic demand. So in that case, the revenue of suppliers or sellers is going to increase if they can reduce the prices. If they reduce costs, there will be enormous increase in output sold, and the opposite is going to happen if they raise the prices. So the government is basically discouraging this sector if it is imposing taxes on this sector's consumption. So if it is discouraging this sector, then what will happen is, when the people's income grow, or when they try to be more cost efficient, or when they try to reduce their cost, I mean, they will not have any incentive to reduce, or they will not have much incentive to grow this sector. In that case, the revenue from the entire sector is going to fall. So at the end of the day, it is not a very attractive proposition for the overall growth of the economy, because this is a sector, the luxury sector, again going as per our understanding of elasticity that we have been discussing since the last classes. Since elasticity of demand for luxury products is very high, it makes sense to encourage this sector to grow and be more efficient, and to reduce their costs and prices, so that the overall revenue grows in the sector. So this was about luxury tax, and demand is more elastic than supply, and suppliers bear most of the tax burden. On the other hand, what happens when there is a tax on cigarettes? When there is a tax on cigarettes, supply is more elastic than demand. So supply is more elastic than demand because cigarette is mostly addictive, and to the consumers or to the smokers, probably they are not going to be able to change their habits or at least in the short run. So and even unlikely to change their habits in the long run. So supply is demand is very inelastic, and on the other hand, supply is more elastic than demand. It is possible for a cigarette company to just start producing less cigarettes, or they can just if they feel that it's unattractive to be in this market, they can quit the market. So smokers bear most of the tax burden in this case. So these two examples show us what kind of issues the policymaker needs to keep in mind when he is deciding who to impose the tax on. When I say who to, it does not mean whether the buyer or the seller, but on which sector. So because we have already seen that imposing a tax on the buyer or the seller does not make any difference as far as incidence of tax is concerned. So we are going to discuss about efficiency of a market equilibrium in the next class. Thank you.